This is A New Angle, a show about cool people doing awesome things in and around Montana. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today, I'm speaking with Tracy McIntyre, Executive Director of the Montana Cooperative Development Center.
During times of great need, we see the cooperative business model really shine, and throughout history, you can see that. In the early 1900s, we saw our ag co-ops really grow. Rural electrification happened in the 30s because of our co-ops. You have telecommunication and credit unions. There were needs, and so you see this throughout history, and we're seeing it again. We're living in it right now.
Co-ops are a unique, overlooked, and often misunderstood type of organizational structure. I'm excited to learn more about co-ops with Tracy right now. Tracy, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
So tell us, where did you grow up and what did your parents do?
I grew up in Eureka, Montana. My parents did a ton of different things, including working Forest Service contracts, but mainly they were artists and artificial insemination in the cattle industry.
So it looks like you've done almost the entirety of your career in economic development. Talk
Correct.
About your pathway into economic development and why it is meaningful to you.
I was 23, moved back home to help my parents out, and I had gotten a job to be a grant writer. My goal was to be in history and museums, but I went home and wasn't planning on staying there, but I was working as a community grant writer, and then we had mills close, 2 forest mills closed.
Yep.
I hit the ground running and kind of started my economic development career by accident.
Maybe go back to that period of time. So the mill's closed. You're young at that stage.
Yeah, very.
And might not have a good sense of what economic development even is.
Well, 20-some years ago, economic development was a very different landscape.
Okay.
Nobody knew what economic development was, right?
Yeah, so maybe give us a little bit of that history.
Economic development was really a lot of men in second careers that had already retired from an area. I think I was one of maybe 7, 9 women, and they were wonderful men. Absolutely great. They definitely were my mentors, and they kind of took us in. You had Economic Development Administration under the Department of Commerce. The state had really started to do a Department of Commerce and the Governor's Office of Economic Development. So you started to see a lot of movement during that time frame. But it wasn't like today. There was no training specifically for us. There was really welcome to our world and
Sure.
Jump in and take over. And that's what I did. Like, I started my first Economic Development Administration grant, came back red because I didn't know how to write one. But it was a Trade Adjustment Act for the Eureka area and trying to get men that had been laid off, men and women that were laid off in the mills, into different training programs or bring training programs in, and really trying to restructure. At that time, Eureka became the most distressed, Lincoln County, the most distressed county in the Pacific Northwest for years. And that's where I cut my teeth in economic development.
Gosh, you've got the decline in the timber industry and the vermiculite mine disaster. So I mean, you're thrown into the deep end of trying to figure out new economic models and opportunities for your community. How did you even, I mean, you mentioned applying for some grants and trying to get people into different types of training, but like, how did you get your head around the challenge in front of you?
I think that anytime you're working in a rural community like that, there's so much opportunities, but there's such a mindset. And especially in forest-related communities, I think this wasn't, and I used to say this a lot, it's not necessarily about the job, it's the way of life. And that is a hard thing to lose.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of issues going on. And it's personal. It's extremely personal. And
It's
I think
identity.
those are things in economic development that I hope we're not losing, but I feel like we're kind of losing some of that. Is that jobs are important, but what are we doing? Like, how are we preserving communities to be what they want to be? And this is what I love about my current job. We don't come in with like, here's your cookie cutter approach or anything. It's really about the local communities having a voice by the local people and trying to find their own solutions. And I've always been passionate about rural Montana and rural America. I think that that's where we need to put some more attention to.
So let's talk about that current job.
Sure.
You're Executive Director of the Montana Cooperative Development Center. We'll get into what your organization does in a moment, but first off, what is a co-op? It seems like an overlooked and maybe misunderstood corporate structure.
Co-ops have been around since the 1770s. 1840s is when co-ops were initially like, this is the structure, and the business component was put around. And Montana has an extremely rich history of co-ops. So co-ops is when a group of people, businesses, organizations, whatever the need is, they form a solution around a need. And that need can be simple as 3 people needing a studio to do some work in, or it could be a massive community-wide, as in a town doesn't have a grocery store, or we need meat processing or childcare. So it's really about meeting a need through a group effort.
Okay.
And then I would think the biggest misnomer, though, and something that we've been hearing a lot about, is that they're charitable nonprofits. Co-ops we don't structure it to be about stockholders, right? We're not structured to make sure that there is a profit being given back to the stockholders. It's really about what that membership and the need is, and it's ran for and by the members. So there's the biggest difference, I think, right there. And sometimes that gets misconstrued of being, oh, well, it's another charity, and it's really not. It's a business, and we need to run it as such. But the opportunity here is it's not about what do we return back to the stockholders as much as what is that need that we're solving.
Okay, solving a need. Who owns it? How does ownership work?
There's 4 different kinds of co-ops in Montana.
Okay.
So that's almost a trick question. So for the most part, though, the thing to remember in any co-op structure is the members own it. So it can be a telecommunication co-op. I see you got Blackfoot Communications up on your deal. Go Blackfoot.
Yes, indeed.
So they're a telecommunication, but the members own that, right? The people that are members of that cooperative structure, they vote for the board, they make those major decisions, and then that is the ownership structure.
Is a member and a customer, are those two
They can be different in
Okay.
some. In some cases, those are different. In some cases, they're the same. So the fun thing about what I do is it's really case by case. So in a utility co-op like Blackfoot, they can have customers and they can have members, and members can be customers. We have probably our richest and most vast is our agricultural community.
Sure.
Those date back. Like I've got one right now that we think was like before the 1900s when it was formed. And so those are a lot of producer and farmers that came together, whether it's market needs or whether it was to buy supplies, but they created those forms. And those are agricultural co-ops. There's state law that says you have to be a producer to be an agricultural co-op. And then what my office is mostly working with is a cooperative association. And we have a slogan, we can co-op that, because there's no requirement for industry or sector. And so we're seeing some really cool co-op ideas coming to the table. And a lot of those have members and they have consumers, and the structures are all over the map, which is awesome.
But let's talk about your organization, the Montana Cooperative Development Center. What do you all do, and what is your purpose?
So our primary purpose is we help provide the guidance to communities. And again, that could be communities, kind of a loose term. It could be 3 people with a need. It could be 5 producers, or it could be a whole town that have a need. But we come in and we guide the process. So we're not your project managers. We don't have the capacity to like project manage it. But we have all the templates, all of the legal knowledge. My team is trained in facilitation and group settings and everything. So we really just come in and guide and help you formulate that co-op.
Co-ops are a form of business. What's the role of entrepreneurship? It doesn't seem like it's a pathway the typical entrepreneur would pursue. It seems like it's more group-centric, like a group comes together with a need, as you were saying.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, group-driven, but I have a lot of entrepreneurs I work with, right?
Okay, so why would an entrepreneur pursue this type of business structure?
I think more than anything, when I see an entrepreneur, like that really true entrepreneur with those big thoughts and plans, and I love entrepreneurs, they're recognizing that they can't do it alone.
So what are the advantages of pursuing a cooperative business structure?
When it comes to advantages, I think one is if you do need that group dynamic, you need that additional so you can raise capital in a different way. Co-ops, especially in those cooperative associations, the one that we have such vastness around, what we can do there is we can create the common stock, which is your ownership stock, but we also can create a preferred stock, which is an investment stock. So you still can go out and you can still get investors and things like that.
Okay.
They just won't own your company. You are making the investment into the company on that. It's still a risk. A lot of what we see when people decide to put an investment into a co-op is the social aspect of it or the need. They're like, hey, this is something I can believe in, or this is an opportunity. So hopefully we've done our job and you do get a return on that investment. But a lot of times it is because you're meeting a need around whatever that case may be.
So you mentioned stock. So there is some form in which ownership is delineated. How is control of the company or the cooperative distributed?
So control is always one common stock owner gets one vote, regardless of if they're also investors.
Okay.
So it's a very democratic process, and it is always an equal ownership. So if you and I belong to it, and even if you put in more money, or in like a worker co-op, you might be CEO and I might not be, we still would have equal say. So the members then vote for their board of directors who oversee the governance of it. And then most co-ops, not all, some have working governance boards, but most co-ops end up with some form of a manager that does the daily operation.
One vote per owner.
Yep.
Regardless of how much stock that owner owns.
So the common stock is really one vote, one ownership. So you don't get to buy more than one stock of ownership.
Sure.
You can buy investment stock, which would just mean that you get to have a return on profit before just a common holder would.
And so a listener could see how this might insulate a company from proxy fights, so to speak, or speculators coming in and trying to drive your business in some way, so it can stay true to the preferences of the members and owners.
Absolutely, right? No one person can own 51% of a co-op. And so that makes it so no one person or one entity can purchase or sell it out from underneath you either. So the perpetual component of co-ops, I think that's why you see some co-ops are well over 100 years old, because it doesn't ever have that, well, I'm going to buy it and change the mission and the reason behind it. It's like, no, that takes a membership vote to dissolve. It takes a membership vote to change purpose. And that's not easily done.
Yeah, and so outside of the ownership structure, what other governance details do we need to know about with regard to focus on the need or other aspects?
Some of the other details that I think are important from a governance standpoint is also that members don't come in and say, well, I own it, I get to tell you what to do as a staff member, right? Yeah. And so there's a lot of educational components that in Montana, we actually have it wrote into the law that some co-ops, the Chapter 15 co-op association where my office deals mostly, it's actually wrote in the law that there is 5% of a reserve built up to do education to membership and board. Like you're constantly reinvesting in that company, in leadership and in governance.
We'll be back to my conversation with Tracy McIntyre after this short break. A New Angle is proudly presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. This show does not happen without these pillars of our community, and I'm so grateful for their support and encouragement. And speaking of support, have you checked out our new website yet? anewanglepodcast.com. There you can support our show directly with a variety of subscription options. Subscribers get access to bonus episodes, additional segments, writings, and other benefits. So check it out at anewanglepodcast.com.
Hey, this is Mark Moss from Tell Us Something, and you're listening to A New Angle.
Welcome back to A New Angle. I'm speaking with Tracy McIntyre about all things co-op. So two prominent cases of cooperatives are credit unions, and then oftentimes when people talk about the co-op, they're talking about a groovy grocery store. Why is it that those two types of businesses are often cooperatives?
I think that just gives, again, control. You control your money a little bit differently. And then when it comes to the co-op grocery store, Montana has been a little behind on that. But what we're seeing, which is fascinating, is we have a lot of succession planning happening in the state. And a lot of mom and pop grocery stores, especially in rural communities, are going to be struggling, or they've told us, what do we do? We're not going to be able to sell this, or if we do sell it, we want to keep this flavor into the community or whatever.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing a lot of interest in converting to community ownership through co-ops of local grocery stores. And those are not necessarily like the co-op. Like when you think of the Bozeman Co-op is such a great example of a community-owned cooperative grocery store. What I see right now, though, is not necessarily that kind of, it's still the same premise of access to food and maybe better and healthier food and controlling some of your own destination around food. But some of these ones that we're talking to right now, like we converted the one up in Turner, Montana, that was just plain access to food, right?
Yeah.
Like there is no opportunity. They're driving 50, 60 miles to the nearest grocery store for the basics of milk. And so that's where we're seeing the biggest growth in.
It occurs to me that could be a powerful force of good in Montana, particularly you see consolidation in the corporate structure. And if we were to let pure market forces run wild, a lot of small communities wouldn't have access to food, wouldn't have access to healthcare, wouldn't have restaurants, wouldn't have hardware stores. So that model you described of succession planning, it sounds like a pathway to maybe preserve some of these local institutions that are needed by the people in these communities.
Some newer structures are emerging. So like the grocery store one that I talked to, one of them that we just did, though, and give a shout out, Hinsdale is doing Prairie Peaks Co-op, and they just formed. They're actually in that incorporation process right now, and they're looking for both common stock and preferred stock membership, so they're open to that.
Yep.
They formed because in Hinsdale, they have a coffee shop ice cream store, which was really their gathering place, right? And they're like, we can't lose this. So they use kind of a combination of a consumer-based co-op model, but through in the opportunity investment model too. And so that community is raising the money to purchase and manage that coffee shop now, because they not only it was more that social fabric that they were concerned with losing. And so I think when we're looking at how can we use that co-op model, the community could raise the money through like an opportunity investment co-op model and then purchase and maybe incubate a new business or something with that. Or we could do the more traditional, let's just create the consumer or the community ownership around and use the co-op structure for that. So we're seeing a lot of communities come to us saying, hey, we need to do something. We're going to lose XYZ business on Main Street, or we have no childcare in this community whatsoever. We need housing, or there's a concern in workforce. So it's the basics that you're hearing. We're just looking at how do we solve those from more of a group dynamic.
Are there constraints that people are listening? They're like, "Oh, co-ops sound amazing." What are the constraints?
During that structure, when we're developing them, you still need leadership, right? And you need champions for the cause, and they can take a while to form because we build that democratic process from the start. We need to make sure that we've kind of incorporated all of those ins and outs in the model of the cooperative. Ones that tend to falter are the ones that there's not strong leadership from the start, or leadership burned out or something like that. So one of the things that we're incorporating into our work is definitely how do we build some leadership components into it and some leadership skills, and then making sure that it's truly a co-op model, that it's not one person's great idea and everybody's like, well, I support you, I don't want to be an owner of it. And then there are some constraints around funding, in all truth. We're seeing more financial institutions come to the table now, partly, I think, because of the work and the outreach we're doing and the education components. And then on the federal level, we are seeing there's the Capital for Co-op Act, the Main Street Act, which is trying to get SBA support for co-ops and stuff. But you're not doing traditional, like you get a bank loan and you put up a personal guarantee. We can't do personal guarantees per se on that. So there is some challenges in the financing, but understanding, like, we've definitely had conversations with some of the angel investor individuals in Montana and educating on what is that investment model. You may or may not actually receive cash, but what's the benefit of it? And really kind of reformulating the way people think about investment.
One of the themes that we've explored in this show is the notion that capitalism is good at giving people what they want, but not what people need. You describe co-ops from the onset as an entity that's created around a need. Is that a pathway forward for sort of keeping some guardrails around capitalism and helping it serve people's needs more effectively?
The cooperative business model is not for everybody.
Yep.
But I do think it puts some parameters around it, right? It comes back to that equal ownership and why are you creating it to begin with, right? And so I believe that co-ops tend to stay more on their path of what they're trying to do, and you don't see as much like mission creep, for lack of better words, or something. Or opportunity may come at the co-op and they may be like, oh, we could do that. But it takes a force of members to say, yes, let's do that. Not one person that could derail an entire business because they want to chase something else.
Does that insulation from following the latest trend or whatever direction a large shareholder would want to take a corporation in, does that also indicate that co-ops might at times be slow to change? You mentioned some of these organizations are 100 years old plus. That's an indication they can change with the times as necessary, but is change sometimes a challenge for these organizations?
I think anytime you're in a group dynamic, change can be challenging. Sure. So yes, we definitely see that. I've had the pleasure of working with some of our older co-ops that maybe changed, but didn't necessarily change their governance structure with that change. What's really cool is I love that Montana is, I mean, you've heard it kind of cliche, but it's one big main street, right? And so we all kind of work together. And so it's not like they're going to be in super trouble if they've changed and not kept their governance in the same way, right? Like we come in, we help them get caught up with whatever changes and things that they've made. Some of what we're seeing, like for an example, some of those old producer supply stores maybe are doing more, they're looking at doing more retail. And they may not be serving just their membership anymore. And there's nothing wrong with that. How did they make those changes? Some have been extremely successful, where some of the smaller ones are kind of struggling with it. You also just have generational shifts happening, which are a good thing. But as with working in community development, economic development, you have apathy at the table. And we have younger generations saying, oh, well, why should I be a member of it? And you also have a disassociation with the original need. And that's a really big one with the age of some of our co-ops. And this is just an observation that I'm seeing is aging boards and aging membership at annual meetings without those younger generations coming in. And then I'll hear like, well, how do we attract them? It's not like they've grew up not needing to worry about where electricity came from, or they grew up knowing the credit union was going to give them a loan for their first truck. The need has been kind of dissipated. But what happens if we don't continue that on? So there's, again, some education about why you need to be involved with your co-op and why it is, as a member, you should go to your annual meetings, that you need to attend and you need to participate. So if I have to say anything that's facing us as one of the biggest challenge, I would say that is coming at us.
Yeah, and it occurs to me, one thing we didn't touch on here is how can co-ops be better for customers? Is there a benefit as a consumer to seek out co-ops versus other forms of businesses?
Well, if you are a consumer owner, absolutely,
Sure,
right?
of course.
That one makes most sense, is that a consumer owner will get a dividend based back. If the company is profitable and doing well at the end of the year in state statute, it says that once a year, the board is required to look at how the co-op is faring and return money to investors and owners, right?
Okay.
So you could have that. And then in general, I think, like, even if you're not a co-op member, I still stop at the Bozeman Co-op because how fantastic is it? And
Sure.
It has all these different types of foods. And I think they can just be a little bit more diverse because they have a broader audience and a broader membership that's kind of saying, hey, let's do this, right?
So in our remaining time, Tracy, I'd love for you to just outline some of the programming you offer for folks who exist in co-ops who are thinking about building a co-op, or what kind of programming does your organization offer?
So Montana Cooperative Development Center, we are statewide, and we do serve the whole state. We actually receive funds from the state of Montana and the U.S. government to provide a lot of our services are free of charge.
Mm-hmm.
And our services can come, like if you have an idea and you're hosting a community meeting, like, hey, we need to figure out some childcare here, and you've heard about the co-op idea, we can come in and help facilitate a community meeting around the general idea and provide like a co-op 101. And then we literally help provide from business planning to facilitation to feasibility study to finding different funding and helping you build your funding scenarios out, like the whole gamut. What's also really cool about our organization is that we help from the start of the idea all the way through incorporation, and then we roughly about 3 years of incubation services is what we call it. But we're also the administrators for the Montana Council of Co-ops, which is the trade association for all existing co-ops, regardless of sectors. So that means we're working closely with the credit unions, the electricals, and telecoms, which have fabulous associations for those trades. But we then can provide services for existing co-ops as well, whether that is that you need a bylaw review, you need to refresh some governance training, you're developing a new line of product and need some additional funding, whatever the case may be, we can provide some different assistance there. So pretty vast.
Yeah.
And we're very hands-on. So it takes a while to form co-ops, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the other thing is that's why I said at the beginning, I can't be your project manager, but we can definitely be there through the whole process. So the best way to reach us is www.mcdc.coop. We have an intake form right there, so you can set up a meeting right online with us, and we get back to you and we start the process. Or the other great thing is that most of us that work for MCDC, we've been part of the economic development world forever. And so we have this large network. So if it's not ours, or we think that you are better fitted with maybe a local EDO first, we make those connections as well.
Tracy, it's been fantastic learning all about co-ops. I do think it's an overlooked space in our economy and an important one, so particularly here in Montana. Thanks for coming in and sharing all this great information.
Thank you. We greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. If you like what we do and want to support us directly, please consider a subscription at anewanglepodcast.com. A New Angle is recorded at Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. Our presenting sponsors are First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Keely Larson is our producer. Maddie Jordan is our production assistant. VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music. And Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.